Good morning. I'm glad you're here this morning. Welcome to Refuge Community Church. We're glad you're here. Glad you chose to brave the cold and rain and sleet and ice. And I don't touch the post office tomorrow. I'm glad you're here this morning. Just a few things I want to advise, and these are things that we talked about recently, so these are not new announcements, but certainly things we want to be aware of. Don't forget about 30-30-90-10. That is our focus for the year. And I know some of us have had this happen or that happen, and we've gotten behind by a day or two on our Bible reading. Keep an eye on that, man. Don't get far behind. Let's stay on top of that. 30 minutes in the Bible each day, 30 minutes of prayer each day, 90% church attendance, and a 10% tithe. All biblical, spiritual disciplines that we're going to commit to this year as a church, and really let the Lord work through us in those things. We've got a women's conference coming up in less than a month now. March 2nd and 3rd, right here, we're going to host our first ever women's conference. Have a service on that Friday night at 7, and then next Saturday from 10 to 3, a service and a lunch and some breakout sessions and all kinds of cool stuff happening. Even if this is your church home, even if you're here all the time and you kind of take that for granted, if you could register, that way we can get an idea of how many folks are going to be here. That would be awesome. The link is out there on the board. You can just go on Facebook and search for... I forgot what it's called, Fearless, that's it. You can search for Fearless Women's Conference on Facebook. You can go to the church Facebook and there's a link, or if you are technologically impaired, we can help you get there and make sure that you get registered. But just so that we get the right count of people to plan for Friday and then Saturday and for lunch and all that good stuff. Don't forget, out here in the lobby there are sign-ups. You can sign up to bring things for the coffee bar, whether you want to sign up to bring a pastry or a thing of fruit, or you want to bring everything for that week. It helps to have all of us pitch in and kind of come together and lighten that load and share it together. And don't forget, we don't take an offering in the traditional sense. There's just a basket by the door. If Refuge is your church home, then we ask you to give and be obedient to the Lord. If you are visiting with us, if you're just hanging out checking things out, please don't feel pressured to give it all. Anything else that I have forgotten this morning? We all good? If you guys want to stand up with me, I just want to say a word of prayer, and I want to get out of the way so we can get into worship this morning. Father, this morning we're thankful for this opportunity to gather in your house in your name with your people. We're thankful, Lord, that we have a church to come to. We have a church that we can come alongside and worship with. We're thankful for this place, but even more so, we're thankful for these people, and even more than that, we're thankful for you. And so, Lord, in this time that we come together this morning, we just ask you to come and have your will and have your way in this place this morning. I pray that as we praise and as we worship in this place this morning, God, that every person in this room that knows you would just begin to sing about and declare what you've done for us. We'd be open and we'd be receptive and we'd be obedient in praise and worship. God, as we go into the Word this morning, would you help it to enter our hearts and our minds just with clarity and understanding, God, that we would get the exact message you have for us this morning. And as we take time to pray and we take time to respond, God, help us to be obedient. Help us to be open and raw and honest before you, that we come and seek you. Because, Father, when we seek you this morning, we can find so much in you. We can find freedom. We can find deliverance. We can find hope in you in this very place this morning. So, God, we just ask you to have your will and have your way in everything that's said and done in this place this morning. We give this time to you and ask you to have your way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Even if I ran away, you're told you my story, you would hear love that never gave up. If I told you my story, you would hear love, but it wasn't mine. If I should speak, then let it be of the grace that is greater than all my sin. Of when justice was served and when mercy wins. Of the kindness of Jesus that draws me in. Oh, to tell you my story is to tell of
kids over for their time together this morning. Well, it happened again this week, and it's something that's happened both weeks of this series so far that we've done on the life of Samson. Somebody came to me and said, I didn't know there was that much to Samson's story. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's fun to study these characters of the Bible. There's a lot more in the Bible than we would normally think, right? Some of you learned that last week when Samson referred to his bride-to-be as a heifer, right? There's more in the Bible than we would think is there sometimes. And even some of these relatively obscure people can help us to really latch on to some spiritual truth. And the exciting thing about Samson is Samson is a man who's easy to understand. Sometimes when I start reading the Bible and I start reading about these heroes of the Bible, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult for us to relate to those people. We read about David and we read about Abraham and Moses, and we see these incredible things that God did through them. And if we're not careful, sometimes we'll think, well, I couldn't be like them. It's almost like we read about those great heroes of the Bible and we think of them as being in some special kind of saintly class while the rest of us are just regular people. Well, the nice thing about Samson is there is no question that Samson does not belong in the special saint category, if there is one. He belongs right here with the regular people, or maybe even the irregular people, because Samson was a little bit messed up. And at least Samson is a man whose life is understandable to us. He is a guy who's a lot like us, and we are a lot like him. And Samson is kind of this spiritual zigzag. He's up and he's down and he's all over the map. And he's totally unpredictable. And that's what makes the story so exciting. And so we've seen Samson's beginning. We looked at it in the first week of this series. We looked at that no Bible character ever had a more promising start in life. And then right out of the gate, Samson starts to make mistakes. It's one dumb move after another. And so now we're going to start to try to trace his life as he starts to fulfill God's purposes. And you won't be surprised that Samson wasn't really trying to do God's will. Really, he was just trying to get even with the Philistines. There's a book that I ran across some stuff for this week. The title of the book is Hearts of Iron, Feet of Clay. And the guy who wrote the book, his name is Gary Enrig. And in that book, he kind of tells a little illustration that helps to put Samson's life into perspective. Because the real question when we read Samson's story is, how did a guy who started out so well end up so poorly? And it's kind of hard for us to understand. But Gary Enrig tells this story of something unusual that happened out on the West Coast about 15 years ago, all the way on the West Coast on the beaches of Oregon and California. There were some whales that were beached out there on the beaches. They had come in when the tide came in, and they drifted in too far, and they got stuck on the sand. The weird thing about this one is that there were over 300 whales beached at the same time in the same place. It was an incredible thing. I actually went through this week and I Google image searched it because you kind of get curious. I was like, what does 300 beached whales look like? I didn't put the picture up there because it got kind of gruesome. But before they could help them, before they could save these whales, all 300 whales had died. And they couldn't quite figure out why in the world did 300 beached whales come all the way in and get beached and not be able to get back out. Like, why did these 300 whales come that far in and end up dead? Here's what they found. Marine biologists came in and they did studies and they went out in the water and they looked and they followed some of these whales around. And what they figured out was that these 300 whales had come to the beach and they met their death because they were chasing sardines. Now that's kind of dumb. Because if you've ever seen a sardine, you know how small a sardine is and how big a whale is. But even a little sardine can bring a whale to its death if that whale keeps chasing it long enough. That's a parable of the life of Samson. He was a guy of enormous resources and enormous strength and enormous support, but he wasted his life chasing small goals. He was a whale who was chasing sardines, and later, in a couple weeks, we're going to see that it ends up costing him his life. In the first week of this series, when we talked about Samson, I told you there were 4 things that made Samson's life really interesting, right? Love, sex, revenge, and violence. We're already past the love and sex part, but don't worry, we will come back to it later. That's going to pop back up in Samson's life, but we are past it for the moment. And so this morning, we're going to look at those other 2 things that we said make Samson's life really interesting: revenge and violence. And this is one of the amazing stories of Samson's life. The story of how this guy who started so well and went down so far, right? We saw that in the first 2 weeks. Week 1, he started at the top, man. Everything was going great. Mom and Dad were behind him. God had a plan and a purpose. He was strong. He took a Nazarite vow. Things were going great. And then last week we looked at how far he fell. This week, we're going to see him turn around, right, and accomplish an amazing feat for God. A man who started high and went low, and now he's going to go high again. It's kind of one of the amazing paradoxes of Samson's life. He lives this up and down spiritual journey. And so we're going to pick up the story in Judges chapter 14. It's the story of Samson's multiplied mistakes. You'll remember, this is where we kind of left off last week. Remember, he went to the wrong place, and he was looking for the wrong thing, and he rejected godly counsel, and he continued a wrong relationship. And so Samson, the man of God, he went to Timnah, which was the home of the Philistines, and there he sees this young Philistine woman. Right? Last week we said she was the Philistine fox. And when he sees this Philistine fox, his hormones start boiling, and he says, "She looks good in my eyes." And that was the beginning of this downward spiral in Samson's life. And so he meets her, and he wants to marry her, and so he asks his father to arrange the marriage with this Philistine woman, which he did. And then down the road, 6 months later, it comes time for the rehearsal dinner and the boasting contest between Samson and the Philistines, who probably were not too happy about seeing one of their girls marry an Israelite. And so eventually Samson gives this riddle to the Philistines. And he's so confident that they will not solve this riddle that he gives them, that he makes this bet with these 30 Philistine groomsmen and says, "If you all can solve this riddle, right, I will give all of you this linen garment. I'll give all of you a new set of clothes. But if you don't figure it out, then you've all got to give me one." And so Samson is cracking jokes, and he's being this big ham, and he's a wisecracker, and he always has a joke, and he always has a witty response. And so he makes this bet with the groomsmen. And essentially, Samson has this plan, right? If they don't solve the riddle, I get 30 new pieces of clothing. I get a whole new wardrobe to start out my marriage with. And Samson was sure that they would never solve his riddle. And so he was laughing all the way to the bank. And the celebration, the wedding feast, the celebration goes on for 7 days. And that gave those 30 groomsmen plenty of time to put pressure on Samson's bride to get the answer from him. And then tell them on the sly. And so they finally go to her and they threaten her on the 4th day, "If you don't find out the answer to this riddle, we're going to burn down your whole household with you in it." We said these Philistines were not very nice people. That was not an idle threat. I would imagine it put a damper on the festive spirit for the bride a little bit. And so she starts begging Samson, and Samson finally breaks down, and he finally tells her the answer to the riddle. And so these 30 Philistine groomsmen come to Samson on the last night of the feast, on the end of the 7th night of this wedding feast. And they come to him and they say, "Hey, Samson, we know your riddle." And suddenly, Samson, the gambler, has lost his bet. And now he has to find 30 changes of clothing. He has to find 30 outfits to give these guys. And that's not even the real point of the story. The point of that story from last week is Samson is upset, and he's angry, and he's embarrassed, and he's humiliated, and all those thoughts of love and romance are just gone out of his mind. And so Samson is angry at being humiliated. He's angry that he was humiliated by his bride-to-be. He's angry that he's humiliated by these 30 groomsmen in front of the Philistines, who he really didn't care that much for anyway. He's angry, and so now Samson is ready to get even. So we'll pick up that story kind of where we left off last week there at the end of chapter 14. Samson does 4 things to try to get even with those Philistines. First, he kills 30 Philistines, right? Verse 19. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who he had told to riddle. Right? So his solution to finding the 30 changes of clothes is not to go shopping. Right? He goes and kills 30 guys and takes their clothes and gives them to the people that he made the bet with. Secondly, he leaves his bride standing at the altar. Verse 19 goes on to say, in hot anger, he went back to his father's house. That meant Samson literally walked out of the marriage ceremony. After he'd gone down to Ashkelon and he killed 30 guys, he went back to Daddy's house. He was done. He went back home and he left his bride standing at the altar. He's angry and he wants nothing to do with the marriage. And so Samson's wife was given to his best friend, right? We would call him in today's culture the best man, the guy who had attended him at his wedding. And we read that and we think that sounds cold-blooded, but put yourself in the place of being the father of the bride in this scenario. He's saying to himself at this point, I don't think that Samson is coming back. And so he figures that Samson has just kind of walked out on this thing. And so he looks at the best man, and essentially I imagine he looks at the best man and says, well, do you want her? Right? And he doesn't have a solution. Samson's not the only one with good eyesight and realizes this is a good-looking Philistine girl. And so the best man says, yeah, I'm going to take her. Right? And so we look down in verse 20, and Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So they get married, right? And we think they're going to live happily ever after. No. That brings us to the third thing that Samson does. Moving on into some new stuff here in a second for this week. Third, Samson decides he wants his wife back. Now, a few months have passed down the road, and now it's the time of what was the wheat harvest. So it was somewhere around May and June, right in the middle of our calendar year. And Samson decides he wants his bride back. He's done pouting. He's over this thing. He wants the girl back. And so Samson takes a young goat as a gift for his bride. He still thinks he's married. He thinks he just walked out on her, right? But he can come back anytime he wants to. He had that typical man mentality, right? Now today, if we want to bring a gift, we bring chocolates, or we bring perfume, or we bring some candy, or maybe if you have the resources and you really messed up, you buy a new car. Just depends on how far in the hole that we think we are. But in that same spirit, Samson brings a goat, right? Because that is sure to win her heart over. I'm trying to make a goat that was doing really badly. Wish I thought that through ahead of time. No! When he gets to her house, he goes to her father, right? And he says, here I am, goat in hand, right? Hey, Pops, I'm back, brought a goat. And essentially, not making this up, it's in the Bible, you can fill in the blanks, right? But essentially, he gets there and he says, I'm going to visit my wife's room. Okay, right? We all know what Samson's thinking. He is not going to his wife's room to have prayer meeting, okay? He showed up, he brought a goat, he wants to go and see her now. But her father wouldn't let him go in. Why not? Well, slight little detail, right? She's now married to somebody else, and there's actually somebody else who is sleeping in there with her now. And so you look at chapter 15, verse 1. After some days, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat, and he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. But Dad, always being cunning here, tries to strike a deal. Look at verse 2. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. Now what a dad, right? This is the guy who left my first daughter at the altar, broke her heart, disappeared, ruined the wedding I had planned. He shows up 6 months later and I say, well, the other daughter's prettier anyway. Why don't you take her, right? And so he tries to strike a deal. But now Samson's upset for 2 reasons. He's upset because his wife is gone. Now he's upset because who he thought was his father-in-law, right, has insulted him. And so in verse 3, Samson replies, he says, Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm you. Samson's mad. He's real mad, right? He's ready to go out and let his anger just boil over because he thought he was going to see his wife. Turns out she's been married to his best friend for a few months now while he's been kind of off and doing his own thing. The first couple of things that Samson did, right? He killed 30 men and then he left his wife standing at the altar. Those are small things in comparison with where he's about to go now. Now he's going to get really serious. So Samson goes out, I kid you not, it's in the Bible, it's written in there. He goes out and catches 300 foxes. Now that alone, I want to know how he did it, right? He goes out and he catches 300 foxes. Maybe jackals, people argue about the translation of the animal. Either way, he goes out and catches 300 wild animals. And then he takes them together in 150 pairs and he ties their tails together. It's in the Bible. I don't know how he did it, but he did it. And I would imagine that that's harder than it even looks. Because I don't know if any of you have ever tried to do that. I've not tried to do it, but I was thinking last night, imagine taking two cats and trying to tie their tails together and then trying to repeat that 149 more times, right? I cannot imagine that that's a fun way to spend an evening. So Samson had to be real mad, right? He caught the 300 foxes, then he ties their tails together in pairs of 2. Then he's not done, right? Because you're wondering, what in the world is he doing with the foxes and the tails tied together? Once he does that, he has their tails tied together. He ties a torch, right, to every pair of tails, and then he lights the torches. Now, I don't know how he did that. Like, I legitimately can't fathom how he did all of that, but that's what he did. And so Samson lights these torches, and then he lets the foxes loose all throughout the fields that belonged to the Philistines. Now we read that and we think that is like the craziest prank I've ever read, and it's in the Bible, right? It's like the craziest frat prank. Like you go to the ag college and you burn their fields down with foxes with torches tied to their tails. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds like a college frat prank, but that's kind of the level that Samson is working on here. And it had to be a bizarre sight, right? Catch the foxes, tie their tails together, tie a torch in there with those tails, light the torches and just let them go and see what happens. And so the foxes at this point are scared to death, right? Crazy, strong, angry man has taken us, jerked us up, tied our tails together, and then put a flaming torch on our rear end. So when they get to go, the foxes go everywhere, right? They go north, they go south, they go east, they go west, they go all different directions. And Samson is just laughing hysterically, right? I got him this time. They deserved it and I got him. Verse 5 says, and when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. So he burned up the stacked grain. In other words, he burned up the wheat that had already been cut down and was harvested and ready to go. He burned the standing grain, right? The foxes did. The standing grain that's out there in the fields, ready to be harvested, together with the vineyards and the olive groves. Now, what you need to know about the Philistines is they were an agricultural society, and they made their money on 3 crops: wheat, olives, and grapes, right? Vineyards. And so it's easy for us to read this and overlook it and be like, Samson got them with the craziest prank there ever was. But what he really did was he single-handedly destroyed the economic base of an entire country. Right? He sends these foxes out and they just start to burn the fields like crazy. All of these 3 major crops that they're growing are just burning like crazy all around him that belong to the Philistines. And so, not surprisingly, the Philistines are not happy. And so when they asked who did this, they were told that Samson had done this because his wife was given to his friend. So the Philistines, it's brutal, but what the Philistines did, they went up at that point and they burned Samson's bride-to-be, the woman he was supposed to be married to. They burned her and her father to death. Now, we told you last week, we reviewed earlier, that these were not nice people, right? They were Philistines. They were not nice people. And it's interesting that last week when we looked at chapter 15, and we went back over that today, that they came to her and they said, tell us the secret of the riddle or we'll burn you and your house down and your father. And so she gets the secret out of Samson, and yet she still ends up getting burned exactly like they said in her home. Guess what? That was only number 3. There's still a number 4. Samson is still going to do one more thing to get revenge on the Philistines. He says to the Philistines, since you acted like this, I'm not going to stop until I get my revenge on you. All bets are off now. Like Samson is still an incredibly angry man. By the way, do you notice what's happening here? Do you see the cycle of revenge? The Philistines do something, and then Samson does something, right? And then the Philistines do something again, and then Samson does something again to try to get back at them. And they do something again, and Samson does something again. And each time, it's getting more and more serious, and more brutal, and more bloodthirsty. Can I tell you this morning that is what happens when you try to get revenge in your life? When you try to seek revenge for the wrongs that are done to you, you will set in motion a cycle of unending violence. It is not in your hands to take revenge. When we do, we get into this vicious cycle like Samson. And the only way to get out of that cycle of violence is to decide not to seek revenge in the first place. Because as long as you want to get even, right, you're going to go like Samson. You're going to go down, down, and down. Now look at what happens in verse 7. Samson says, "Since you've acted like this, I swear I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." And then verse 8 says, "He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them." The King James Version has a different interpretation of that probably is a really good, accurate description of what happened. It says he smote them hip and thigh, which is really just a metaphor to say it was a violent, bloody massacre. You know what Samson did at this point? His anger has consumed him. When he kills them, literally, what it's saying is Samson is literally ripping them apart hip and thigh. Like I'm saying, there are piles of arms over here, and legs over there, and heads over there, and torsos over there. Like I don't need to go any further. It is the Old Testament version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Samson was a guy who did not want to get mad at you because he could lose control really fast, and he could go way over the line, and it would be too late. So Samson slaughters them, and then the second half of verse 8, it says, "Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Edom." Now, all we've seen so far in this passage, this chapter we've been looking at today, is revenge and revenge and revenge. But now, all of a sudden, Samson goes and he stays in this cave in the rock of Edom, which seems kind of odd, right? You're the dude burning their fields down and literally ripping them apart, but now you're going to go hide in a cave. Why? Because at the end of the day, Samson is scared of the Philistines. And we look at that and we say, well, my goodness, I would think it would be the other way around. That's the strange thing about Samson. Even though he's a violent killer, in his heart, he is scared to death of the Philistines. He's scared of what they're going to do to him because of what he has done to them. And I'm going to tell you something that I can't prove. I can't prove this statement, but I really do believe that it's true. I believe that the beginning of this spiritual turnaround in Samson's life took place in that cave at Edom when he's hiding from the Philistines. I think that Samson, like David is going to later on, is in a cave and he's thinking about his life and he's thinking about his background and he's thinking about his family and he's thinking about his godly heritage. And I think Samson in that moment began to reevaluate the course of his life. I say that because as soon as Samson comes out of the cave, things start to change. Things start to shift, right? Samson, week 1, when we first started reading about him, we started at the top, and now he's gone down and down and down. And he has made an unending series of stupid decisions time after time. He's become nothing more than a bloodthirsty, violent, terrorist kind of killer. He's at the bottom now, like rock bottom. But when he comes out of the cave, he starts to act a little bit different. We pick up the story down in verse 9. Right? Philistines are still mad at what he's done. It says, the Philistines came and encamped in Judah. In other words, the bad guys came to the good guys' turf. The Philistines are moving into the Israelite territory. They are looking for Samson. Look at verses 10 and 11. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom. Isn't it interesting? It took 3,000 men to make them feel safe to go see one of their own men. 3,000 men of Judah, 3,000 of the good guys go down to see Samson. And I want you to listen to the cowardly words they had for Samson at the second part of verse 11. And they said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you've done to us?" Like, what is happening to the children of Israel? They're called to be the people of God. They're called to drive the pagan nations out. They're called to stand for righteousness. And now they're saying, "Oh, Samson, don't you know that the Philistines are over us? They've got iron and we've only got bronze. They'll kill us, Samson. Are you crazy? What are you doing?" Instead of coming to Samson and saying, "Let's go get him," right? They're saying to Samson, "Don't you know it's supposed to be that way?" Really, there are three words in that story that kind of tell us the story of the attitude that the children of Israel had. In verse 10, we had intimidation, right? The Israelites are scared to death of the Philistines. They were so frightened that they come and they approach Samson and they ask him to surrender to the Philistines. In verse 11, we have accommodation. They were so accustomed to the status quo. They said, "You know, we kind of like having the pagans rule over us, right? We're scared of what will happen if you try to upset the apple cart." And then in verse 12, you have the ultimate inevitable result of intimidation and accommodation, which is cooperation. It's one of the saddest verses in the whole story. Verse 12. They said to him, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." We who are supposed to be your friends, we've come and we're going to tie you up and we're going to hand you over to the Philistines. Like Israelites, you 3,000 guys, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of God or are you on the side of the devil? Because the people of God now are doing the dirty work for the pagans. And this is the tragic picture of the spiritual decline of the whole nation. They didn't want to be set free because they were too scared to fight. They were scared of the unbelievers. They were intimidated by what the unbelievers might do to them. And so they just said, "It's supposed to be this way, Samson. It isn't good, but it's supposed to be this way, so just don't rock the boat." And what you have in verses 13 to 17 now is really the pinnacle of Samson's faith. He was on the bottom, but now he's starting to rise to the top. And what we'll see in these next few verses is Samson really rising to the highest point he's going to reach in his whole life. See what happens? It begins at the end of verse 12 and it goes on into verse 13. Samson said, "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." "Agreed," they answered. "We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you." Cowards. Those sniveling cowards. Those peace at any price compromisers. They were lousy bums, right? "We won't kill you. We'll just hand you physically over to the Philistines." What do you think the Philistines are going to do with him? They're going to kill him. That really stinks. But notice how Samson responds. He says, "If you want to hand me over to the Philistines, that's all right." He treats his countrymen graciously. That is a shift. That is a change in Samson's demeanor. And so here comes Samson, right, with his hands bound with two ropes, walking toward the Philistines. And down in verse 14 it says that as he approached, the Philistines came toward him shouting. Well, I guess so. Right? They think they've got him now. They think they've got the man who burned their crops and killed their people. They think they finally got Samson. And verse 14 goes on to say, "The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands." But keep reading with me because it gets better. "Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey." Now the word for fresh the word really means moist. And I know some of you don't like that word, but that's what it means, right? Meaning, donkey ain't been dead real long, right? The jaw of the donkey was still moist. And so Samson finds this jawbone of a donkey, pretty random, and he strips off the skin, and he picks it up, and he wades down into the Philistines. Now donkeys have narrow jaws, right? So picking up a jawbone is like picking up a boomerang. And verse 15 says that Samson took that fresh jawbone of the donkey, and with it he struck down 1,000 men. Now you say, how did he do that? I don't know. I don't know how he did that. I did when I was reading. There was one intriguing suggestion that a Bible scholar made. He said that it's possible Samson could have took those ropes, right, that were on his hand and tied it to the jawbone and put the other one under his wrist, and he's just swinging it, right? And it just becomes this deadly jawbone of doom that Samson's out there swinging on the battlefield. I would imagine you could do some pretty serious damage that way. But regardless, the Bible says that Samson killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. In fact, that series, that image for the series that's been up there every week that says Samson, that's actually what that is. If you notice Samson down to his side, he's holding the jawbone of a donkey. Well, eventually, it's all over, right? The Philistines have fled, and the battlefield is just littered with 1,000 corpses of all these people that Samson's wiped out. And so Samson, complex little dude that he was, is out and he's walking through the battlefield where these 1,000 dead bodies are. And you know, what do you do when you're walking through a battlefield of 1,000 dead bodies you just killed with a donkey jawbone? He writes a poem. And so in verse 16, Samson records his poetry. Samson said, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." Well, there's a nursery rhyme to teach the kids tonight. But actually, the Hebrew word for donkey and the Hebrew word for heaps sound a lot alike. And so a lot of the translations will say, "With the donkey's jawbone, heaps upon heaps." So that little bit of poetry tells us what happened. Samson would take the jawbone and he'd kill a few men and he'd make a heap of dead bodies. And then he'd go out and he'd kill a few more men and he'd make another heap. And by the time he's done, there are heaps and heaps of dead bodies totaling up 1,000 men that he killed. Verse 17 says, as soon as he had finished speaking his little poem, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramoth-Lehi. Ramoth means hill, and Lehi or Lehi means jawbone. So Ramoth-Lehi literally means jawbone hill. So this physical place got renamed as a reminder of this great victory that had been won there. Now the story's almost over, but there's one more part. Samson has this really humble prayer to the Lord now that starts in verse 18. It says, because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord. You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So Samson was really thirsty because, killing 1,000 guys with a donkey jawbone will work up a little bit of a thirst. And so he cries out to the Lord. And honestly, from what we have recorded in the Bible, this is the greatest prayer that Samson ever prayed. Right? He says, Lord, I know this victory didn't come by my power. That is the one place that Samson really acknowledges the power and the presence of God in his life. And look at verse 19. Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En-Hakkore, and it is still there in Lehi. Now that last little phrase is interesting, right? Because the writer of Judges tells us that even though years and years and years have passed, there's still water coming out of that spring. The flow of water was still there as a present reminder of God's past provision for His people. See, Samson's greatest prayer comes right after his greatest victory. And Samson sees that prayer immediately answered. And it shows us something we might not have seen otherwise. Beneath the carnality, beneath the flesh, beneath the worldliness, beneath all of the compromise, there's this bedrock of faith in Samson's life. Samson was a man of faith, and that's kind of unbelievable, right? After all that carnage and all that killing and all that lust and all that anger, God says Samson is a man of faith. And He lets that spring keep on flowing even after Samson gets a drink as a reminder of Samson's faith and as a rebuke to those cowardly, compromising men of Judah. It was a reminder that when things are at their worst, that there was one man there who was willing to stand up and fight. And I think this is one of the most wonderful stories in the Old Testament. Because really, what a sinner Samson is. He sins and he sins and he sins and he sins. And he doesn't do it by halves either, right? When Samson sins, he really sins. And he goes down and down and down and down. And then he begins to come up. And his faith now is clear. Because in the end, God gives Samson a great victory through His power. I think this story can teach us a lot of different things, but I want to show you three things that I think this chapter in Judges, this portion of Samson's life can teach us. Number one, whenever we come to a moment of spiritual victory, we should not be surprised that other people don't understand us. Whenever we come to one of those great moments of spiritual victory, when we've prayed and we've worked and we've fought through, we shouldn't be surprised that other people don't understand us. Because if there's anything that's clear from Judges 15, it's that the people, the children of Israel, were ready to give Samson up. They handed him over to the enemy because they didn't understand that Samson, at this point, is God's freedom fighter. It's the one point where Samson's faith is really kind of shining. The men of Judah just looked like a bunch of cowards, and that's really what they were in this instance. We shouldn't be surprised when we reach a moment of real spiritual insight that some of the people who are closest to us won't understand. A husband won't understand, or a wife won't understand, or your brothers and sisters won't appreciate the fact that you've discovered Jesus, or your relatives or your kids or your grandparents or your friends or your neighbors or people you work with won't understand. We shouldn't be surprised when we decide to go all out for Jesus that there are going to be some people who won't understand. There are going to be some people who will actively oppose what we're doing. It happened to Samson, and it happens to me, and it'll happen to you too. Secondly, whenever the Spirit of God starts to work, incredible victories can be accomplished by means of the most unlikely instruments. Suppose you were going to go out to fight 1,000 Philistines, right? What would you take? I'd take Rambo and a pickup full of Uzis, and I'd bring along an AK-47 and a bag of grenades, and I might take my chances that way. I probably wouldn't go out with the jawbone of a donkey, right? I'm not that stupid, or maybe I'm not that smart. But when Samson defeated 1,000 Philistines, he had two things. He had a jawbone of a donkey, and he had the Spirit of God. And with the jawbone, whatever, but with the Spirit of God, he had enough to defeat 1,000 men and set the army of the Philistines to flight where they were running away from him. I wonder this morning if there's anybody here who feels a little bit like the jawbone of a donkey. If you've ever been made to feel like you're useless, let me tell you something this morning. When the Spirit of God starts to move, right, with the jawbone of a donkey, an entire army was sent running. When the Spirit of God starts to move, incredible victories can be accomplished even through the most unlikely of instruments. And thirdly, when we yield ourselves to the Spirit of God, the life of Jesus is reproduced in us. If you go back and you read some of the older commentators from a couple hundred years ago, they find that Samson is what's called a type of the Lord Jesus Christ. In other words, he was an example. He was a picture of truth we were going to see in the New Testament. In other words, here's how they put it together. Samson is rejected by his countrymen. Jesus is rejected by his countrymen. Samson is arrested by his own people. Jesus is arrested by his own people. Samson was handed over to certain death. Jesus was handed over to die, right? Samson didn't resist his own people when they betrayed him. Jesus didn't say a word to those who betrayed him. Samson's hands were bound with cords. Jesus' hands were bound with cords as he goes off to trial. Samson broke the cords that bound him. Jesus, in his resurrection, breaks the cords of death, right? Samson, in his victory, puts the Philistines running. Jesus, in his resurrection, defeats Satan and all the demons of hell and disarms them in this public spectacle. Samson, in his victory, delivered his people, right? Jesus, in his victory, delivers all people. You know why this picture of Jesus is in the Bible? Because Samson is the last person on earth that you would ever expect to be like Jesus. You couldn't think of a more unlikely person. And I think that's there to encourage you and encourage me. Because we sometimes have a whole lot of Samson in us. And it's there to encourage us, guys, we can be like Jesus. Samson, the guy who goes down and down and down, is an example, is a symbolic, is used symbolically in the Bible to teach us about Jesus, right? What happened to Samson can happen to you and me. When we give our life, when we yield our life to Jesus and the Spirit begins to work in us, this is Samson's finest moment. This is Samson's greatest victory. This is Samson's noblest prayer and his most holy character. And the most amazing thing that I think we've said this morning is Samson's greatest moment. The pinnacle of his faith comes at the end of all of these incredibly stupid decisions. He went to the wrong place, and he looked for the wrong thing, and he married the wrong girl, and he made a bad bet, and he gave in to revenge, and he had uncontrollable anger, and he went down and down and down. And it's at this hopeless moment that Samson achieved greatness. His past didn't matter. It really didn't matter in that moment. That is the grace of God. And some of you this morning are laboring under bad decisions, stupid moves, wrong choices, blind alleys, dead-end streets, broken relationships, and broken promises. And every time you think about doing something great for God, there's this voice in your head that begins to come in and begins to whisper, you're dirty, you're unclean, you're no good, you're a fake, you're a fraud, you're a hypocrite. I've got good news for you this morning. I don't care if you've been like Samson. I don't care if you've been worse than Samson. Your past doesn't matter. If you'll come to Jesus, you'll find in one shining moment that you're forgiven. And your past doesn't have to hold you back anymore unless you let it. Because you already know. You already know what's holding you back. Those mistakes and those bad decisions, those alleys and those broken relationships, those stupid choices. And you've condemned yourself 1,000 times for them. They're like chains around your neck. You need to take all of that. And you need to put it at the foot of the cross. And you need to leave it there. And you need to never go back for it again. You see, this morning, I want you to understand that there is a God in heaven who wants to do something with you. Guys, He used Samson. Samson, who we saw last week do nothing but stupid stuff. God still used him when he was yielded, when he came before God with humility. Can I tell you this morning, I don't care what you've done. I really don't. I don't care how messed up you are. I don't care how broken you are. I don't care how far you've gone. I don't care how far past too far you feel like you've gone. God can still forgive you. God can still redeem you. God can still use you. So this morning, if you've never accepted Jesus as your Savior, I want you to know this morning, He wants to save you. There is no exception there. We sang it this morning in that song, Oh, the blood, in my sin. Yet even then, He shed His blood for me. He shed His blood for you, knowing you were going to mess up, knowing how far you were going to go. And He still gave His life. He still shed His blood so that you could be forgiven. If you've never been saved this morning, I would love to pray with you. I would love to introduce you to Jesus and show you what the Word says and lead you to what He would love to do in your life this morning. So if you've never been saved this morning, I'll be over here to this side of the stage. I would love to pray with you. I'd love to talk with you. Maybe this morning you've been saved, but man, you've just done some goofy stuff. You've made some dumb mistakes, right? And the enemy just haunts you with it. It's like he just holds it over your head and says, you have messed up. You have left it. You have lost it. God can't use you. You're a hypocrite. You've gone too far. And you were just constantly haunted by these mistakes you've made. Would you come and leave those at the foot of the cross this morning? Would you come and leave that behind? Because God wants to use you. Same God who used Samson in the midst of all of those mistakes and all of that dumb stuff that he did, the same God wants to use you and empower you. Guys, if He can empower Samson with the Spirit of God and bring victory through him, He can empower you with the Spirit of God and bring victory to you. See, the enemy wants us to think that we're not worthy. The enemy wants us to think that we're too far gone. The enemy wants us to think that God can't use us. The enemy wants us to think that we're too jacked up. The enemy wants to do that because when he does, he can cripple us, and he can stop us, and he can keep us from moving. This morning, I want you to know, I'm going to ask the worship team to come. And they're going to lead us in a song as we have a time of prayer this morning. And the words of that song say, there's nothing too dirty that He can't make worthy. I want you to know this morning, I don't care what you've done. I don't care how far you've slid back. I don't care all the things that you've done wrong. I don't care about the mistakes that you've made. There's nothing too dirty that He can't make worthy. So as we stand this morning, if you've never been saved before, you've never asked Jesus to forgive you of your sins, there's nothing too dirty that He can't make worthy. He would love to rush in this morning and save you from your sins and redeem you and change your life forever. I'll be right over here to my right. I'd love to talk with you and pray with you. Maybe this morning you've been saved, but you just goofed up somewhere along the way. You did something stupid, a couple stupid things, a few stupid things, and now you're just consumed by that. He wants to forgive you, and He wants to set you free. He wants to free you from the guilt and shame. There's nothing too dirty that He can't make worthy. This morning, if you feel like there's a little Samson in you, God can still use you. God still wants to use you. God still has a plan and a purpose for you. There's nothing too dirty that He can't make worthy. Come let Him wash you in mercy this morning. Come let Him forgive you. Come let Him set you on the path with Him. Come let the Spirit of God empower you and give you victory the same way He did for Samson. If you need to come and pray this morning, would you just be honest and respond the way God wants you to?